Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today, again, with the always brilliant Dr. Yakov Rabkin, an emeritus professor of history at the University of Montreal. Yakov, welcome back.
Thank you.
Yakov, we recently met actually in Russia, where we were at a conference about Russophobia, and you made a very important observation, and that is that the stereotype of Russophobia that we talked about has a lot of resemblance to the stereotype of anti-Semitism. And you yourself wrote a lot about the topic of Israel, of the way Israel uses and abuses a couple of stereotypes, and we should probably discuss this one. What are these resemblances of the two stereotypes?
Well, if you permit, I'll start with a joke. It happens in Berlin in 1938 after the pogrom of Kristallnacht, and two Jews meet in a street in Berlin, and one of them noticed that the other one has a copy of Völkische Beobachter, the notoriously anti-Semitic newspaper. Says, "How can you read this?" he said with a lot of indignation. Says, "Look, it gives me solace. It's so bad around here, and I open this newspaper. We are the most powerful. We control the world. It really is very pleasant." And this joke really illustrates the same thing about Russophobia. So on the one hand, Russia is retarded, underdeveloped, cruel entity. On the other hand, it can't win in Ukraine, it's losing the war. But on the other hand, militarized because it's about to invade Lisbon. So you have these incompatible messages that are broadcast in the case of anti-Semitism and Russophobia, and they don't seem to disturb a lot of people because they're essentially irrational. They work on your emotions. And therefore, your rational analysis, which really is not particularly complicated, to say, well, you can't have an army that is so retarded and uses chips from washing machines for the military, and at the same time about to invade the entire Europe. And no one asked the question, why? What's the purpose? And I think this characterizes the times that we are living in. While anti-Semitism has been discredited after the Second World War, Russophobia wasn't. And both of them originate, I would say in the 19th century. Definitely the two terms, Russophobia and anti-Semitism, emerged in the 19th century. In one case, it was a Jewish Viennese intellectual who introduced the term anti-Semitic prejudice. And Russophobia was introduced by a Russian intellectual and writer, poet, Tutchev, pretty much at the same time. In a letter to his daughter, he wrote that there is a certain, if you allow me, I think I'll quote it directly from the letter, because it's quite interesting that he was writing in a private letter. He was saying to his daughter in 1867, un fait contemporain qui prend de plus en plus un caractère pathologique, c'est la russophobie dans certains Russes, fort honorable d'ailleurs, a contemporary phenomenon which takes a more and more pathological character. It's Russophobia in certain otherwise honorable Russians. I quoted it in the original French because that's how the intellectuals in mid-19th century communicated with each other. And it is very telling that the Russophobia first was coined as a term in Russia with respect to Russians who hate themselves, so to speak.
Mm.
Again, we are talking about another 19th century term, which is more often used with respect to Jews, Selbsthass, self-hate. So you have those two phenomena, Russophobia and anti-Semitism emerging. Of course, the word Russophobia in English appeared earlier. What I found is that it was John Stuart Mill who criticized the government at the time of unnecessarily inflating the British military budget to counter an exaggerated threat from the Russian Empire. Does it sound familiar?
Copy paste. 200 years and nothing changed.
And Mill stated, I quote, "The real cause, however, is one which it would not have been convenient to avow. The ministers are smitten with the epidemic disease of Russophobia."
Hey, just a very quick note. The best way to support this channel is by signing up for my free Substack. You can also help with a paid subscription there, or you can get some of our new merch on neutralitystudies.com. Links below. See you there. We've discussed this a lot, and it is really fascinating that you have again and again coming up these stereotypes then, right, of what the Russian is, the Russian, and the Jew. This is quite an important, they're quite important figures, straw man stereotypes in order to ratchet up a political favor on the other side to then counter that, right? That's also what the joke that you quoted alludes to, right? So you need to create something that is at the same time ridiculous but scary. What other kind of parallels are there that and do you think that this contemporaneous nature of the two stereotypes is coincidental, or do they actually go together? Because Russia, the lands of Russia and the Slavic lands were, of course, lands also largely populated with quite a big proportion of Jews compared to, like, let's say, in Western Europe at the time.
Well, definitely. And if we look at the hate of the Jews, the anti-Semitism, and Russophobia, they merged in the minds of the Nazis. Because they were fighting against Judeo-Bolsheviks. For them, Bolsheviks were Russian, and the way they presented Russians, and of course, they rarely used the term Soviet. They used Russian when they were invading the Soviet Union. They considered the Russians as Mongols, Asiatic hordes, and they attack the Russians so that they should not invade the pristine, cultured Europe. So the whole idea of attacking the Soviet Union was wrapped in Russophobia and, of course, anti-Semitism. And the orders that the German military received as they invaded the Soviet Union was, well, it's going to be a different war. It's not the same war that you waged in France. Here, it's a Vernichtungskrieg. That's the extermination war. And they were quite true. For once, they didn't mislead anyone because, and this is very important, there were at least 10 million Slavs, Russians, Belarusians, Poles, others, who were killed by the Nazis, civilian Slavs. But somehow it passes under the radar of our historical memory.
Yeah.
We focus on the 6,000 murdered Jews.
6 million.
Somehow, 6 million, but we somehow forget about the others who were, well, the gypsies. But today we are talking about Russophobia, so I'm putting emphasis on the extermination of Slavic population.
Yeah.
And that Slavic population had to be exterminated because they were presented as Untermenschen, as inferior kind of people. Uh, and moreover, these retarded Untermenschen had to be eliminated because the fertile lands were to be colonized by German peasants, and they didn't need so much labor there. So you have to exterminate the population to make room for the onset of civilization. Uh, that's how it was presented. And I think it is very important to understand the, I would say, equal opportunity genocide that existed during the Second World War.
Oh, you're putting it into very provocative words, but the equal opportunity genocide being then, of course, the genociding of everybody on these lands, right? Not just the Jews. I mean, you get rid of the others too, and in a very sad way, this is it's not that different from this idea of Lebensraum in the in America of the West, of manifest destiny. That's where one is supposed to go. And over there, the result that we see is, of course, the one that was described by Hitler for the East, with a completely new population then taking over the lands and today living on those. So in a very sad sense, what we're seeing is just a continuation of European approach at colonizing lands, don't we?
True. In fact, the first genocide that the Germans committed was not even in Europe. It was in Southwest Africa in the beginning of the 20th century.
Right.
But that didn't register in the collective memory of Europe.
In Namibia, right? The Namibian genocide.
Very, very little. So I think that the colonial attitude, the racist attitude, is very deeply ingrained in European history. Uh, we talk about, even though today often you hear that American troops were fighting against forces of racism in Europe. Well, American army was segregated. And when I think it was de Gaulle who asked Eisenhower at the liberation of Paris that the French units should be the first to enter Paris rather than American. The answer was okay, provided they're white. And there weren't too many white Frenchmen in the army at that time.
The racism at the core of these kind of European projects, be it whichever it is quite staggering. And the thing, though, is that the memory about it today tries to portray everything as an anti-racist struggle, when in fact, if we look at the sources, as you're doing, you see like, no, there was racism on all sides embedded in it. Do you think, though, that the racism, because one of the things that we also came to is, of course, in the conference, is that Russophobia, just like anti-Semitism, is a form of racism. Do you think that these two types of racism, though, are kind of stand out, or not stand out, but are different from like, let's say, the racism against blacks or against Asians, or are they more or less the same?
Well, I tend to think that racism includes different kinds of discrimination and negative attitude and so on. And it's based on essentialism. What is essentialism? When you ascribe certain qualities, properties, certain modes of behavior to groups, and you say, well, Jews are, and then you put adjectives that you like, and the Russians are so and so. So, and the blacks are, it's the same thing. Now, why, the good question is why the murder of Jews attracted so much attention, whereas the murder of other people in Europe and outside of Europe didn't.
It did.
And I think that here, I think it was Aimé Césaire, a Martinique intellectual, who wrote in 1955, and I'm paraphrasing, He said, the reason we focus so much on the Holocaust is that for the first time, mass murder of Europeans took place. Whereas in previous cases, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, they were killing non-Europeans, and no one paid attention.
But that definition of his actually excludes the Slavs from the group of Europeans too, right? Because they too are Europeans, and kind of he forgets about those as well, as you just pointed out earlier.
Well, you see, all these categories are social constructs.
Yes, of course.
So, of course, both Jews uh, and the Slavs were present, and the Russians were presented as Asians. And that was very easy. Actually, if you look at the propaganda films during the Nazi period, they chose Soviet soldiers from Central Asia, prisoners of war, to show, well, these are the Asiatic hordes that we're facing. So they were really presenting them as non-European, that Asians. And of course, at that time, and I would say till today, this kind of exclusion appears legitimate because, look, the way immigrants are hunted in the United States, I mean, it's largely racial profiling. I mean, that's very clear how it works. Also, the war on terror that was inaugurated in 2001 had a lot of racist overtones. And today, I think racism is flourishing to a large extent because of, I would say, macroeconomic and macrosocial issues. Now, we are talking about a world in which 17 individuals hold as much wealth as 1/2 of the Earth population. This kind of inequality definitely undermines any pretense for democracy. But you cannot have a democracy with this kind of polarized economic situation. And that explains why people who are frustrated, who are unhappy, their anger is directed towards the other. And the other could be a Jew, it could be a Russian, it could be an Arab, it could be a Muslim. In other words, this is a manifestation of a phenomenon that I outlined in the book Demodernization, and that's what we talked about at the conference. You cannot detach it. The way to look at both anti-Semitism and Russophobia is to see them in the context of very serious crisis that makes people susceptible to this kind of scapegoating. See, you scapegoat because you prevent the masses from acquiring a certain class consciousness and directing their anger at the exploiters, not at people who are even more exploited than themselves.
We definitely need to discuss this, and I will also ask you about the political abuse of all of this, because what you just described now, the psychological element of this, I think, is intuitively kind of easy to grasp. Why then, on an individual level, people start taking refuge in racisms in order to deal with problems of their lives. But what you also allude to, let's maybe discuss then about the use of the political use of racism later. But what you also alluded to is this very important issue of demodernization, which you discussed brilliantly in that conference. And with demodernization, if I remember correctly, what you mean is all of these kind of the all of the modern concepts that we developed, especially within liberal democratic societies and so on, that are now bit by bit being undone or turned into their opposite. And I think recently we're seeing another one of these, for instance, this chat control in the European Union, which is the reversal of the secrecy or privacy of the letter, right? Of like message of communication between people. Can you maybe speak a little bit also about this demodernization and in what sense it is a reflection of the tremendous crisis this West is currently going through?
Well, I think after the Second World War, there was awareness that the world is changing and we have to improve the world on it. And that was the awareness in the context of the Cold War, when former colonized countries were acquiring independence and they were choosing a way to modernize. So there were proliferation of modernization theories, both in the United States and in the Soviet Union, but they were to a large extent similar because they were preaching reducing economic inequality, education, healthcare, rational debate, informing policies. All of these good things were supposed to help the new nations develop and become self-sustaining. So, except that, of course, Americans privileged private property. The Soviets were talking about socialist mode of production, but in other ways, they were very similar. Now, when in the late 80s, you observe the beginning of this rapid polarization in terms of income and wealth, you see that many of these features begin to decline. And again, what happened in the former Soviet Union is perhaps more graphic because it happened more rapidly. But the same phenomena happened elsewhere. Well, what happened very rapidly, of course, is the pauperization of the population and concentration of wealth in the hands of a handful of people in today's Russia, Ukraine, Central Asian republics, and so on. So the masses are pauperized, and the very small group of people become ultra rich. In society where there was really no economic stratification to talk about, well, very, very little of it, at least. So, and in the Soviet Union, after, particularly in the former Soviet Union in the 90s, you have proliferation of all kinds of irrational beliefs, all kinds of gurus that appear on television and promise you happiness. It had never existed there, but it erupted because there was a need for irrational explanation of what is going on. And there was also a privatization, not only of industry, but also privatization of anger. Rather than, well, let me explain. Rather than acquiring a class consciousness and saying, well, you're being exploited, someone is stealing you the wealth you developed, says, no, you have to look into yourself and develop psychologically. In other words, it's all a private issue. It's not a social or political issue. You're turning it towards yourself.
You need the wealth mindset. If you've got the right mindset, money will come. If you don't have money, you don't have the right mindset. That kind of scapegoating the victims, right?
Right. So it's called the privatization of anger. So it becomes a private issue. It's no longer a class issue. It's no longer a political issue. It's no longer a tax issue, because people talk about this economic injustice as if it is a natural phenomenon, just happened. The tsunami. Well, you're in Japan, so tsunami happened. There's nothing you can do about it. But that's not the case. This polarization is handmade. It's made by people who profit from it. And these people have to be kept accountable. And racism, anti-Semitism, Russophobia are precisely the means to prevent this accounting.
perfect in order to now talk about the political use of these concepts, right? And we've had other discussions. Alexander Mercuris gave a very good presentation on how this Russophobic stereotype has been used time and time again, especially in British literature throughout. He also gave counterexamples because Russophobia and anti-Semitism is never total, right? You will always find counterexamples of people who will speak well about that group. But you also find the undercurrent. And the thesis there is that the undercurrent is very much politically motivated because it fulfills a purpose. And you're saying like one of the purposes is to prevent a class consciousness from emerging. But on the other hand, we also see people who clearly have a desire to resolve certain issues through war, and they use it as a pro-war narrative. Can we maybe speak about that a bit, and how, again, Russophobia, anti-Semitism, and maybe also Islamophobia these days are like playing into exactly that kind of understanding of where the enemy is?
Yes, and I will breach from what I just said into what you're asking me. It's precisely because there is an economic crisis that they are seeking war. It's precisely because of that the only way they think they can lift Europe in particular, but also the United States, from the crisis of the political West is by militarization. And for militarization, you need the enemy. And the enemy is, of course, Russia. It doesn't take much because the decades of Cold War presented the Soviet Union as Russian, and it was menacing. But again, in both cases, in the Cold War and what's happening today, there was no rational debate. It was assumed that Stalin was about to invade the entire Europe. And therefore, as early as August 1945, General Patton was writing to his wife that Russians are underdeveloped and he is not interested in understanding them. He is only interested in knowing how much steel it takes to kill one. We're talking about August 45, when the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States. Actually, it's if I remember correctly, it's 8th of August, and it's a very telling date because it's between two nuclear explosions in Japan.
Yeah.
6th and 9th.
Yeah.
And again, I can give you a lot of examples that I'm about to write an article about it. When to justify war, you have to present the enemy, and in December 1945, the chief of staff received a paper on plans to subject Soviet cities to nuclear attack. In December 1945, we're talking about 2 months after the end of the war. So we're talking about the construction of the enemy, which is essential. And I think that there were some sober minds who realized the danger of it. One of them was General Eisenhower, who in his parting speech at the end of his mandate pointed at the danger of the military-industrial complex, which today is, I think Jeffrey Sachs says, military-industrial digital complex. So we're talking about the need to present the enemy, just as the Nazis presented Russians and Jews as Asians that have to be exterminated. They have to be, because they're about to attack, they're about to control the world, they're about to subjugate us. And they are qualitatively different, they're ontologically different, they're Asians.
this racist discourse is fascinating. You know how it is useful to different political strains within the society, within society, and of course what you outlined before. A lot of Marxist scholars would immediately say, yes, of course, we told the you for a long time that it is the economic structure that determines whether or not countries go to war, not great power or whatnot. But as soon as you have a struggle, an economic struggle emerging, the natural tendency of capitalism is to focus its violent tendencies to the outside, and for that you then need these ways of transmitting it, right? The pathways. So in this sense, Russophobia and anti-Semitism are pathways of doing that. And of course, also the very convenient way of having an enemy on the outside and an enemy on the inside that you can also fight against whenever something is opposing that kind of structure, isn't it?
No, definitely, because in both cases, if we're talking about what's going on today, you have to mention also a different kind of political use of Russophobia and anti-Semitism. In the case of anti-Semitism, it's really on the surface. You could see it because the State of Israel and those who support it try to cast any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. And therefore, the purpose of that is to stifle debate, to stifle rational discussion by pointing at your adversary as unacceptable in polite company, and therefore illegitimate argument. Now, with the Russophobia, there's something similar that is happening. As soon as you personally and some of your interlocutors on your channel start talking about understanding the Russian position, understanding the Kremlin, that by itself becomes a source of accusation of treason.
Dirty. It's a dirty thing to do.
Sorry?
It's a dirty thing to do, especially in German. I mean, in the German language. Russians, Putin versteher, an understander, is something negative. By default, you don't even need to prove it anymore. It's quite fascinating.
No, but I think that you stifle rational debate.
Right.
In both cases, you stifle rational debate. And I think it is very important to discredit Russophobia just as anti-Semitism is discredited. It, as I mentioned before, it has to do with the historical memory of the Europeans and countries of European settlement. You know, the United States, Australia, Canada. And it's very interesting that Russophobia cannot be found outside of these bounds. It's an entirely political West.
It is.
Because there was a survey around the world, attitude towards different countries, and you see that as soon as you leave the political West, attitude towards Russia become positive.
I'm working on a paper that I call the One West in order to make one distinction with the concept of the political West, which is that the political West, usually we even include countries like Japan and South Korea, but there it doesn't apply. I contest that in Japan we do not have Russophobia in the way, shape, or form the way that we have it in Europe and North America. We just don't. So there's this one kind of type of cooperating Western countries that has very, very specific racist stereotypes about the others, and they deploy that. And the others, they might have other problems, but not that one. And maybe, I'll let you reply to this first, and then I have one more thing to add.
No, well, I just said that countries of Europe and European settlement, and that doesn't include Japan and Korea.
Right. They were not settler colonies. They were, yeah.
No, but there was a certain logic of settler colonialism that I mentioned with respect to Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union or the Israeli settlement, Zionist settlement of Palestine, and there are many other examples. where you have to use prejudice. You have to explain why what you are doing is legitimate. And it's legitimate because you bring culture, or you bring Christianity, or you bring civilization, la mission civilisatrice, or the white man's burden, or responsibility to protect. I put them all in one basket.
I
Yeah.
I think they belong together. They're like they're shaped by the same way of understanding the world. And while we are at it, I have one thing to add or to ask you about, which is this difference between, the sin of committing the sin of trying to understand the Russian, trying to understand Jews from within and understand how it works, versus knowing the Russian and knowing the Jew and then being able to apply the stereotype, right? That's what we are seeing at the moment. You're not supposed to understand, you're supposed to know how Putin works. And then you've got a lot of people on TV who will tell you with the veneer of experts that we will tell you because we know the Russians. And then usually what comes is a very Russophobic statement about like very specific stereotypes. So does this would just add additional kind of support to what you said, right? We need to prevent people from trying to understand, and we need to impose the stereotype as hard as possible.
Well, I think that's what essentialism is. When someone says the Russians, the French, the Swiss are like that, it means that they're attributing certain modes of behavior and certain ingrained or genetic predisposition to groups. This is called essentialism. The essence of the Russian is, and then fill in the blank. The essence of the Jew is, that's that. Now, what is very important in any rational discourse is to be aware that within the Jewish population, there's tremendous diversity. And you could see it today. And that's why anti-Semitism, that is raising its ugly head in many countries, is really misdirected. In many countries, there's accused Jews of the crimes that Israel has been committing in West Asia. Jews are very much divided about it. The fact that Israel claims that it represents all the Jews shouldn't be convincing, because the majority of Jews today in North America, maybe in Europe, realize that Israel is committing crimes. And you see, well, the support for a Muslim anti-Zionist socialist Mamdani as a mayor of New York. He was supported by huge numbers of Jews in one of the, I think, the most Jewish cities in the world, New York. So it's very important to understand that there is diversity among Jews, just as there is diversity and debate within Russia. You see, again, Russia is presented as a monolith, that Putin is sitting on the top. He decides, no one discusses anything, just everyone obeys. Well, it's just enough to open the magazine Russia in Global Affairs. It's in English. And you could see different opinions there about the conduct of this war. And they called it war way before Peskov recently admitted it. So there is debate. There is debate in foreign policy circles in Russia about the position of Russia in the world, about the attitude towards the United States. So it's a diverse society. Some people support this war. Some people don't support this war. So it's a very, very complex picture. But racists don't like complex pictures. For them, it's clear. I understand the Russians. They're, and then fill the blank. And therefore, we have to militarize. We have to ensure our security by deterrence and by military means. what used to be the case before, that diplomacy could lead to mutual security, is discarded, totally discarded. And again, it's discarded because there is a need to militarize. There's an economic need to militarize. There's a social need to militarize. And in order to make it happen, you cannot have a rational debate of exactly what is the menace, what are we trying to defend from.
And there's an epistemic need to militarize. I mean, and I think in Europe we are at that point now, because I've had this discussion just last week with a Swiss journalist, and she asked me, like, very seriously and very honestly, isn't it the case that small countries just need larger countries to be their protectors, to be there, to give security guarantees to them? Otherwise, the small ones will necessarily die. And I had to explain to her, look, if you only have friends in the international environment, if nobody wants to attack you, that's the best kind of security you can get. If the fact of the matter to me is that at the moment in Europe, everybody has stopped thinking about how to cooperate and starts to and thinks solemnly in terms of deterrence, how to deter, forgetting that the Germans and the French don't deter each other anymore. They because they manage their relationship by being in a good relationship with each other, right? But the Europe thinks itself so far into this deterrence structure that they lose at the moment, in my view, a lot of them, the ability to think outside of the security paradigm, the deterrence paradigm. And the Russophobia, I think, is a major reason why you got people epistemically that far down the rabbit hole.
Well, I think that I would like to defend European politicians for
Really?
uh,
Okay.
indeed, their intellectual quality leaves much to be desired. Their knowledge of history leaves much to be desired. But they're taken in a structure of the European Union,
Mm.
which originally was meant to ensure peace in Europe, that particularly, as you mentioned, between France and Germany. And this vocation of the European Union has been totally forgotten. And the European politicians that I'm trying to defend are uh, not even aware of their national interests.
Yeah.
They are talking about Europe and European Union, particularly after its expansion to the east, has become really a subject of the United States. So these politicians who grew up in total submission to the United States, in total submission to a centralized structure of European Union, no longer even think of national interests. They were not educated this way. If you take even, during the Cold War, there was NATO and there was the European Union, but there were politicians that had a concept of national interest. You may agree or disagree with de Gaulle. You may agree or disagree with Margaret Thatcher. I mean, they are not necessarily my heroes, but they had a concept of national interest. Today, you have these politicians who really are not impressive, and they are not impressive because there was a selection, a natural
Yeah.
selection, if you like, to be obedient to the United States, to be obedient to this collective West, if you like, without any democratic legitimacy. And today, you see it in, as I said in the very beginning, when you have such tremendous economic polarization in the world, you cannot expect to have democracy. So you have political leaders or political, well, let's call them leaders for lack of a better word, like Merz or Macron or the old or new British prime minister, it really doesn't matter. Uh, they are extremely unpopular. They, and yet they're making fateful decisions about dismantling welfare state in favor of militarization without any democratic mandate to do so. It's particularly uh, absurd in the case of Canada, because the only country that has threatened several times Canada was its southern neighbor. Trump keeps saying that Canada should be the 51st state of the United States. So I understand Canadian establishment is worried, and they tried to defend Canada against Russia and China. Now, again, it's absurd, and even though Canada is trying to diversify its uh, purchases of military equipment, so they buy from Sweden and Germany, but they still buy an awful lot from the United States, the only country that threatens the existence of Canada. So that shows that national interest is not a concept, it's rather submission to the will of the collective West. And you see, I'm saying that not the United States, even, because we have to realize that apart from political establishment, there is a financial establishment which has to think differently. Whereas politicians get elected or not, 4 years, 7 years, depending on the country, Goldman Sachs has to plan decades ahead. Big financial institutions have to be very rational in what they're doing. And it's precisely their rationality that has to be transmitted to the population in extremely irrational terms.
Mm. I very much like your concept of the unimpressive by design. And the design is, of course, one that then allows for the entire political developments that we're seeing. And it's not necessarily that it is the United States that, or the president of the United States who holds all of the strings in his hands. No, it's more like the entire system. And this is why I would like to call my essay the One West, the group of people who jointly profit from the way the system is set up, and who then explicitly and implicitly start cooperating and collaborating throughout the ranks in order to perpetuate that system. And within this perpetuation, what we see time and time again is the political use of these racist stereotypes. Can I maybe ask you about one thing? Because the way, I think one way in which Russophobia and anti-Semitism differ is the way that they developed after the Second World War. Russophobia stayed very much on point of what it did before, whereas anti-Semitism then starts, played this very important role for Israel, which is itself a settler colonial project. But it then starts taking a different end. Like before the Second World War was like, let's get rid of the Jews. That was the point of anti-Semitism. And then after the Second World War, it became a way to defend the occupation of Palestine. Do you have any thoughts about the way that anti-Semitism changed its nature, that political nature?
Anti-Semitism didn't change. Anti-Semitism is racism against Jews, against the Jew. And there are a lot of people who believe that. So it hasn't disappeared, it hasn't changed. What has changed is that anti-Semitism was discredited after the Second World War. And therefore, it became an accusation that makes people step back. And since Israel presents itself as the Jewish state, and we can talk about how legitimate that claim is, it's a very problematic one. Therefore, Jews become hostages to Israeli policies, Jews elsewhere, not only. Yeah. And for people who are not very educated, and for people who look for simple solutions and who are anti-Semitic, they would attack Jews wherever they live because they think that they're helping Palestinians, or they think that they're helping world justice, or so on. So anti-Semitism hasn't changed. What has changed is the fact that the Israeli government and the Zionist establishment, including many Christian Zionists, used the accusation of anti-Semitism in order to stifle debate about Israel. So, and Israeli politicians are very open. Today, there's one advantage of today's world. There's a clarity. You have to read what people say, Israeli politicians, and you don't have to guess anything. It's all there. And when they're accused of genocide, it's a blood libel. It's an anti-Semitic accusation. So whenever there's a criticism, it's always deflected as dismissed as anti-Semitism. And that's very dangerous because anti-Semitism is losing its sense, its meaning, if it's misused this way.
Yeah, no, I agree, which is why it is important time and time again that we drive home the differentiation between Judaism, Zionism, Israel as a political project, well, which is basically Zionism, but we differentiate this, because otherwise we fall into the other side of the trap, right? Conflating Jews with Zionists. This is it's actually part of the trap.
Yeah, well, I think there's one aspect that I mentioned briefly in the beginning, the self-hate.
Right.
And I think it is important to understand it as well in the context of both anti-Semitism and Russophobia. Now, I remind you that in his letter to his daughter, Tuchev wrote about Russophobia, that is the disease of the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
And John Stuart Mill referred to this as a disease of the British. So it's very interesting. So what do I mean? I mean that there is a concept of self-hatred, and it's very common in colonial contexts when natives educated in Europe start to despise their own group because they're not cultured, they're not civilized. And this is how you have both, in the case of Jews and Russians, significant numbers of people who would transmit this anti-Semitic or Russophobic cliches. If you look at the writings of the founders of Zionism and the State of Israel, it's full of anti-Semitic cliches. Jews are unproductive, they're exploitative, they're degenerate. I have it in my book on Jewish opposition to Zionism. But you find very similar things among Russians who were imbued with European culture, and their attitude was, and today say they're pro-European, pro-American, pro-Western, and they would despise everything Russian, saying that they would repeat these Russophobic cliches. So this exists also on the level of these groups within themselves. And both of them have to do with colonial mentality. In other words, you have an encounter of cultures, and you consider the other culture to be superior to yours.
There's entire YouTube channel.
Sorry,
there's entire YouTube channels by Russians who live in the West who will explain to you all the things that are wrong with the Russians. It's quite fascinating.
Right. And they're credible because they're Russians and they must know what they're talking about. And the others are Jews, they must know what they're talking about, Jews. So you have, but again, it's essentialism, it's irrationality, it's demodernization. I'm always bringing this together. You are looking for non-rational explanation for serious problems that you face. And these people from within those groups provide those irrational explanations.
And these irrational explanations, or these explanations that cannot be approached through rationality, then help the political elites that are fostered through the system to direct the violent potential of society into conductive ways, right? Conductive to them, to their self-preservation. So to the outside or to the enemy within.
Right. And I think there has been, discrimination of Russian artists and Russian renaming of paintings, because I was in New York recently, and I went to Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I love, and I saw a painting by Ilya Repin, who's known as a Russian painter, and he lived in St. Petersburg, and a Ukrainian painter, a Ukrainian artist, because he was born in the territory of today's Ukraine. When
It
he was
was
born,
called that. It was written there, Ukrainian
yeah, it
artist.
was written Ukrainian artist, and I shrugged. But I wonder if, in the collective memory of the Europeans and in the countries of European settlement, the pogroms that happened in the Russian Empire will be remembered as Ukrainian pogroms or Moldavian pogroms rather than Russian pogroms. No.
And you made that point just before we started recording, actually, also about the siege of Leningrad, which gives kind of an insight also in how other places approach, warfare. And I think the example you made is that during the siege of Leningrad, St. Petersburg, they never actually stopped playing Beethoven and German artists.
Yes, and I think there was a German film made about the siege of Leningrad, and a fiction movie, and there were two German generals during the siege of Leningrad. They listened to the Leningrad radio, and they hear Beethoven. They say, "Look, these Bolsheviks are playing our music." So that's, for them, it was something. How dare they do this? But I think it's very important. Racism can be found in many countries. And but we have to say that Western Europe, because of its colonial, not because, but in the context of its colonial adventure, has been particularly racist.
Yeah.
And I think it is important to understand, because it's not only the fact that Leningrad Symphony was playing Beethoven during the siege of Leningrad, but also the fact that the expansion of the Russian Empire was a land expansion. It was not, and therefore they integrated the ruling classes of those countries into their own. If you were a Georgian prince, you would be a prince in St. Petersburg, and many of them actually became prominent generals and so on. So the Russian imperial history is different from Western European imperial history. And in the sense that you had integration of different groups, and many Russian aristocrats have family names like Yusupov, clearly of Tatar origin. But they're perceived as Russian aristocrats without any hyphen. So in that sense, perhaps the Nazis were right. They were Asians in the sense that they integrated Asians as well. Whereas for the Europeans, and the Nazis were Europeans, the racial distinction is very important. And that's why I think this racial distinction you find also in the novels of Benjamin Disraeli, the British politician, a Jew who was converted to Christianity, and he wrote about, he wrote novels, among other things, and the racial dimension was very present there. And Hitler in 1941 writes that, we, the Nazis, also understand that the race is the key concept for understanding, like this Jew Disraeli wrote in his novels. So you have to understand that when Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, wrote, "Anti-Semites will be our best allies and friends," he knew that what he was founding was congruent with the anti-Semitism in Europe.
Mm. we're reaching the 1 hour mark. It would be fascinating, and we have to continue this probably another time to talk about these different versions of empire, integrative empire, like the Russian version of it, versus ethnic based empire of like expansion of the race versus expansion of the territory with whoever is there. But it would take us too far. Yakov, is there something that we didn't touch upon that in closing you would like to state?
Well, I would like to say that racism should be understood in a broad sense, not in terms of color of the skin, but say there was anti-Irish racism in the British occupation, in English occupation of Ireland. There is maybe it's a myth, but you hear it a lot in Montreal, that there were times in Montreal when someone would go into a department store and speak French, and the answer would be speak white. Well, both were obviously white. And of course, Russophobia and anti-Semitism deal with white people. So racism, as I said before, is an equal opportunity phenomenon.
Thank you very much for making equal opportunity even less attractive than before. Oh my. Yakov, people who want to find your writings, where's the best place to go?
I have a website which you can put there, and I'm trying to create a Substack. So far, my technical skills haven't allowed me to do so. And there is a site in academia, so I'll send you both, and you can put them in the recording.
I'll put them into the description box below, and we will certainly talk soon again. Professor Yakov Rabkin, thank you so much for your time today.